In 2002, a neurosurgeon in Switzerland placed an electrode on the brain of a 43-year-old woman and pressed a button. The woman, fully conscious, lying on an operating table during a procedure to treat her epilepsy, immediately reported that she was floating above her own body. She could see herself from above. She could see the doctors. She could see the operating room from a perspective that her physical eyes, pointing at the ceiling, could not have provided. The neurosurgeon pressed the button again. The experience repeated. He moved the electrode. The experience stopped. He returned the electrode to the original position. The experience returned. The out-of-body experience was reproducible. It was controllable. It was produced by electrical stimulation of a specific brain region, the temporoparietal junction, the area where the temporal and parietal lobes meet, approximately 2 inches above and behind the right ear. The neurosurgeon was Olaf Blanke, now a professor of neuroscience at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, and one of the world's leading researchers on bodily self-consciousness. And the experiment did something that decades of anecdotal reports, mystical testimony, and philosophical speculation had not accomplished. It brought the out-of-body experience into the laboratory. The experience was real. The patient genuinely perceived herself from above, genuinely saw the room from a displaced perspective, genuinely felt that her consciousness had separated from her body. The experience was neural. It was produced by electrical stimulation of a specific brain region, suggesting that the brain contains the circuitry for generating the perception of disembodiment. And the experience was reproducible. It could be turned on and off with the press of a button, like a light switch for the soul. Blanke subsequently identified the specific neural computation that the temporoparietal junction performs and that is disrupted during the out-of-body experience. The TPJ integrates 3 types of information: visual information about the body's position in space, vestibular information about the body's orientation relative to gravity, and proprioceptive information about the body's internal configuration, the position of the limbs, the tension in the muscles, the angle of the joints. Under normal conditions, these 3 streams of information are consistent. They all agree that the body is in a specific location, oriented in a specific direction, configured in a specific posture. The TPJ integrates them into a unified sense of self-location. I am here. But when the 3 streams conflict, when the visual information says one thing, and the vestibular information says another, and the proprioceptive information says a third, the TPJs. Integration fails. It cannot construct a coherent model of self-location from contradictory inputs. And when the integration fails, the brain does not simply report an error. It generates an alternative model, a model in which the self is located elsewhere, viewing the body from outside, experiencing reality from a displaced perspective. The out-of-body experience is not a breakdown of the self-location system. It is the self-location system generating an alternative solution to an insoluble integration problem. The brain cannot place you in your body because the signals are contradictory, so it places you outside your body. The experience is the brain's best guess under impossible conditions. Blanke confirmed this by studying patients with neurological lesions in the TPJ region. Patients with damage to this area show a significantly higher incidence of spontaneous OBEs than the general population, and the OBEs correlate specifically with the laterality and the extent of the damage. Right TPJ lesions produce more OBEs than left TPJ lesions. Larger lesions produce more frequent and more vivid OBEs. And the OBEs can be modulated by vestibular stimulation, caloric irrigation of the ear, which artificially stimulates the vestibular system, can trigger or terminate OBEs in susceptible patients. The experience is neural, the mechanism is identifiable, the system is mappable. Blanke's discovery did not prove that consciousness can leave the body. it proved something more nuanced and arguably more important. The brain constructs the experience of being in a body. The sense that you are located inside your body, behind your eyes, between your ears, looking out at the world from a fixed point in space, is not a given. It is a construction. It is produced by the continuous integration of visual, vestibular, proprioceptive, and tactile information by the temporoparietal junction and associated brain regions. And when this integration is disrupted by electrical stimulation, by neurological damage, by extreme physiological stress, or by specific meditative practices, the construction fails. The sense of being in the body dissolves, and consciousness, freed from its usual spatial frame, experiences itself as located somewhere else above the body, beside the body, or in no particular location at all. Henrik Ehrsson, a neuroscientist at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, extended Blanke's work with a series of experiments that demonstrate just how fragile and how malleable the sense of bodily self-location really is. Ehrsson began with the rubber hand illusion, a deceptively simple experiment first developed by Matthew Botvinnik and Jonathan Cohen in 1998. A participant sits at a table with one hand hidden behind a screen. A rubber hand is placed on the table in front of them, in a position that could plausibly be their own hand. An experimenter simultaneously strokes the hidden real hand and the visible rubber hand with a paintbrush, the same location, the same timing, the same rhythm. Within about 90 seconds, something remarkable happens. The participant begins to feel the brush strokes on the rubber hand. The rubber hand feels like their own hand. And when the experimenter suddenly strikes the rubber hand with a hammer, the participant flinches with a measurable galvanic skin response, an accelerated heart rate, and a genuine startle reaction as though their own flesh had been threatened. The brain has adopted the rubber hand. It has incorporated an inanimate object into the body schema, the neural model of the body that determines where I ends and not I begins. The boundary of the self has been redrawn by sensory manipulation. Ehrsson extended this to the full body. In his most famous experiment, a participant sits in a chair wearing a head-mounted display that shows a live video feed from cameras mounted behind them. So the participant sees the room from the perspective of a point located 2 meters behind their actual body. An experimenter simultaneously touches the participant's chest with a rod, which the participant feels but cannot see, and moves a second rod toward the cameras, which the participant sees approaching the virtual chest they are observing from behind. Within seconds, the participant's sense of self-location shifts. They feel that they are located at the position of the cameras 2 meters behind their actual body. They experience the visual perspective as their own. And when the experimenter makes a sudden threatening movement toward the cameras, the participant shows a measurable fear response, increased skin conductance, increased heart rate, as though the threat were directed at their actual body. The brain has been tricked. The self has been displaced. The body is here, but I am there. Ehrsson then went further, inducing participants to identify with a mannequin body, with a tiny doll-sized body, and even with a body of the opposite sex. In each case, the multisensory manipulation succeeded in shifting the sense of self-location and body ownership from the physical body to the substitute. The implications are extraordinary. The self is not anchored to the body by any fixed mechanism. It is anchored by the ongoing integration of sensory information, and when the integration is disrupted or redirected, the anchor lifts. The self floats free, not metaphorically, experientially. The participant genuinely feels displaced. The participant genuinely identifies with the substitute body. The participant genuinely startles when the substitute body is threatened. Ehrsson's experiments demonstrate that the sense of being in a body is a perceptual construction, a model, a best guess, a continuously updated hypothesis that the brain generates by integrating multisensory information. The model is usually accurate. The brain correctly concludes that you are located inside your body because the visual, vestibular, and tactile information is consistent with that conclusion. But the model can be disrupted by providing conflicting sensory information. The brain can be induced to locate the self outside the body, in a rubber hand, in a virtual avatar, or in empty space. The self is not fixed. It is computed, and the computation can be altered. This raises a question that neuroscience has not answered. If the sense of being in the body is a construction, what is the thing that experiences the construction? If I can be displaced from my body by a video feed and a rod, if my sense of self-location is a perceptual hypothesis that can be overridden by conflicting data, then what is the I that is being displaced? The brain constructs the model. But who observes the model? The neuroscientific answer that the observation is itself a brain process, that there is no observer separate from the construction, is logically coherent but phenomenologically unsatisfying. Because the experience of being displaced from the body is not experienced as a change in brain processing. It is experienced as a change in location, as a genuine movement of the self from one place to another. The self that was here is now there. And the self that is now there is the same self that was here. The observer has moved, the body has not. And the question of what the observer is, and whether it can move independently of the body, is the question that the out-of-body experience poses with unavoidable force. The most medically rigorous evidence for out-of-body experience comes not from the laboratory, but from the emergency room, from the thousands of patients who have been resuscitated from cardiac arrest and who report experiences that occurred during the period, when their hearts had stopped and their brains showed no measurable electrical activity. These are near-death experiences, NDEs, and they have been documented, studied, and debated for over 4 decades. Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist, published the most rigorous prospective study of near-death experiences in The Lancet in 2001. Van Lommel followed 344 consecutive cardiac arrest patients at 10 Dutch hospitals. All had been clinically dead, no heartbeat, no breathing, no measurable brain activity. All had been resuscitated, and 62 of them, 18%, reported near-death experiences. The experiences included feelings of peace and happiness, the perception of moving through a tunnel toward a bright light, encounters with deceased relatives who communicated without words, a panoramic life review in which the person re-experienced every significant moment of their life from the perspectives of all the people involved, the perception of a boundary or border that could not be crossed without dying permanently, and in a significant minority, the perception of leaving the body and observing the resuscitation from above. The life review is particularly striking from a neuroscientific perspective. Patients described re-experiencing their entire lives not as a sequential narrative but simultaneously, as though all moments existed at once and could be accessed in any order. They experienced the emotional impact of their actions, not from their own perspective, but from the perspectives of the people they had affected, feeling the joy they had caused, feeling the pain they had inflicted, experiencing the consequences of their choices through the eyes and hearts of others. This is not ordinary memory. Ordinary memory is sequential, partial, and experienced from the first person. The life review is simultaneous, comprehensive, and experienced from multiple perspectives. It is, if taken at face value, a form of consciousness that operates outside the normal constraints of time and self-perceiving all moments at once rather than sequentially, and perceiving from multiple points of view rather than from a single subjective position. The medical significance of Van Lommel's study lies in its prospective design. Previous NDE studies had been retrospective. Researchers interviewed patients after the fact, often months or years after the experience, introducing the possibility of memory, distortion, embellishment, and confabulation. Van Lommel interviewed patients within days of their cardiac arrest, while the memory was fresh, while the medical records were available for comparison, and while the details of the resuscitation could be verified. The cross-cultural dimension adds weight. Bruce Grayson, a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia and one of the founders of near-death studies as an academic field, has compiled NDE reports from cultures as diverse as India, Thailand, West Africa, Native American communities, and pre-contact Aboriginal Australia. The core features the tunnel, the light, the deceased relatives, the life review, the boundary. The out-of-body perspective appear across cultures with a consistency that cannot be explained by cultural expectation alone. The details differ. The tunnel may be described as a cave, a river, a road, a passage between worlds, but the structure is shared. The Indian NDE and the American NDE and the Thai NDE describe the same experience in different cultural vocabularies, and the consistency across cultures argues against confabulation. Confabulated memories are individual, shaped by personal expectations, cultural narratives, and post hoc rationalization. The NDE report showed a common structure, a structure that was remarkably similar across patients who had no opportunity to compare their experiences and no shared cultural framework for interpreting them. Sam Parnia, critical care physician at New York University's Langone Medical Center, launched the AWARE study, Awareness, during resuscitation in 2008, the largest prospective study of consciousness during cardiac arrest ever conducted. The study spanned 15 hospitals in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Austria, and it included an ingenious methodological innovation. Parnia placed shelves near the ceiling of the resuscitation rooms, each bearing a randomly generated image that could only be seen from above, from the perspective of a disembodied observer looking down. If a cardiac arrest patient reported an out-of-body experience and correctly identified the image on the shelf, it would constitute strong evidence that the patient's consciousness had genuinely accessed a visual perspective that the physical eyes could not have reached. The results were tantalizing but inconclusive. Of 2,060 cardiac arrest patients enrolled in the study, 330 survived. Of the survivors, 140 were interviewed. Of those interviewed, 9 reported near-death experiences, and 2 reported visual awareness, the perception of seeing and hearing events during the resuscitation. One of these patients, a 57-year-old social worker, provided a detailed, accurate account of events that occurred during the 3 minutes after his heart stopped. He described specific sounds, specific actions by the medical staff, and the use of a specific device, an automated external defibrillator that was deployed during his resuscitation. The details were verified by the medical team, but the patient did not see the image on the shelf because his cardiac arrest occurred in a room where no shelf had been installed. The verification target was missed by logistics, not by the patient's perception. The AWARE study did not prove that consciousness leaves the body during cardiac arrest, but it documented, with rigorous methodology, that some patients report accurate perceptions of events that occurred while their brains showed no measurable electrical activity. The conventional explanation that the brain generates these experiences during the transition into or out of cardiac arrest, during the seconds of residual activity before the EEG flatlines or after it resumes, is plausible but faces a difficulty. The patient described events that occurred during the 3 minutes of verified cardiac arrest, not during the transition. The brain was flatlined. The perception was accurate, and the gap between the two, between the absence of measurable brain activity and the presence of accurate perception has not been closed by any conventional neuroscientific explanation. Michael Bohm, a cardiologist at Emory University, documented what may be the most evidential case in the NDE literature. Pam Reynolds, a 35-year-old singer-songwriter, underwent a procedure called hypothermic cardiac arrest for the removal of a brain aneurysm in 1991. The procedure is radical. The patient's body temperature is lowered to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, the heart is stopped, the blood is drained from the brain, and the brain's electrical activity ceases completely flat. EEG, no brainstem reflexes, no auditory evoked potentials. By every clinical criterion, Pam Reynolds was dead. Clinically, neurologically, electroencephalographically dead. And yet, when she was revived, she reported a detailed near-death experience. She described specific surgical instruments, a pneumatic bone saw that she said looked like an electric toothbrush that she could not have seen because her eyes were taped shut and covered with drapes. She described a specific conversation between the surgeon and the cardiac surgeon about the size of her femoral arteries, a conversation that occurred while her ears were plugged with molded earpieces emitting 100-decibel clicks for the purpose of monitoring brainstem function. She described the specific song that was playing in the operating room Hotel California by the Eagles during a phase of the procedure, when she was fully anesthetized and her brainstem showed no auditory response. The details were verified by the surgical team. The perceptions were accurate, and they occurred during a period when every measure of brain activity registered 0. The Reynolds case has been debated for 3 decades. Skeptics argue that the perceptions could have been formed during the induction or emergence from anesthesia brief windows when some brain activity was present. This is possible. But it requires the assumption that Reynolds formed highly accurate, verifiable perceptions during moments of minimal brain activity, perceptions that included visual details, eyes taped shut, auditory details, ears plugged with 100-decibel clicks, and conversational details, specific medical discussions that would be extraordinary even for a fully conscious, unimpaired observer. The skeptical explanation does not require consciousness leaving the body, but it does require consciousness performing at a level that exceeds normal waking performance during moments of profoundly impaired brain function. Neither explanation is comfortable. Both require something extraordinary. The neuroscience of out-of-body experiences reveals a tension at the heart of consciousness research. On one side, Blanke and Ehrsson demonstrate that the sense of bodily self-location is a brain construction, a model that can be disrupted, displaced, and manipulated. This suggests that OBEs are neural events, products of the brain's modeling machinery going awry, generating a disembodied perspective from the same mechanisms that normally generate the embodied perspective. On the other side, Van Lommel, Parnia, and Sabum document cases in which the disembodied perspective appears to access veridical information, accurate perceptions of events that the physical body could not have perceived. This suggests that OBEs may involve something more than a malfunctioning model, that consciousness may genuinely access perspectives that the brain's sensory apparatus cannot reach. The tension is not resolved, the evidence is not conclusive in either direction, and the honest position, the position that this investigation is committed to maintaining, is that both interpretations are possible, that the evidence supports neither definitively, and that the question of whether consciousness can genuinely separate from the body remains open. But the question is not merely scientific, it is also experiential, because out-of-body experiences are not confined to operating rooms, cardiac arrests, and epileptic seizures. They occur spontaneously during sleep, during meditation, during moments of extreme stress or extreme relaxation, during the hypnagogic state between waking and sleeping, during sensory deprivation, during extreme fatigue, during high-altitude mountaineering, during combat, and during the practices that the contemplative traditions have been refining for millennia. Surveys consistently show that between 10 and 20% of the general population reports at least one out-of-body experience during their lifetime. Susan Blackmore, a psychologist at the University of the West of England, surveyed over 1,000 respondents and found that 12% reported OBEs. Harvey Irwin, a psychologist at the University of New England in Australia, found rates of 15 to 20% across multiple survey populations. The experience is not rare. It is not pathological. OBE experiences show no higher rates of psychopathology than the general population. It is not confined to any particular culture, religion, demographic, or psychological profile. It is a feature of human consciousness, a capacity that the brain appears to possess, that the traditions have cultivated for millennia, and that the quantum framework we have been building across these investigations may begin to explain. Robert Monroe, a Virginia businessman with no background in spirituality or parapsychology, began experiencing spontaneous out-of-body experiences in 1958 and spent the rest of his life investigating them. Monroe founded the Monroe Institute in Faber, Virginia, and developed a technology called hemisync audio patterns designed to synchronize the brain's hemispheres and facilitate OBE states. Monroe's approach was empirical rather than mystical. He documented his experiences with the precision of a laboratory notebook, recruited volunteers to replicate the experiences under controlled conditions, and collaborated with researchers including Charles Tart at the University of California, Davis, who conducted some of the earliest controlled laboratory studies of OBEs. And Inventive classed. Tart monitored a participant who reliably produced OBEs and asked her to read a 5-digit number placed on a shelf above her bed, visible only from an elevated perspective. On one occasion, the participant correctly reported all 5 digits. The probability of guessing a 5-digit number by chance is 1 in 100,000. The single trial is not definitive. A single correct guess, however improbable, does not constitute scientific proof, but it is consistent with the pattern that runs through the entire NDE and OBE literature. Some experiencers appear to access veridical information from perspectives that their physical bodies cannot reach. The information is not always accurate. The verification is not always possible. The conditions are rarely controlled, but the pattern is consistent enough, across enough cases, documented by enough independent researchers, to warrant serious investigation rather than reflexive dismissal. The experience is a feature of human consciousness, because the deepest question is not whether consciousness can leave the body. The deepest question is what consciousness is, and whether being in the body is a fundamental feature of consciousness or a contingent construction that can be altered, suspended, or transcended. The pharmacological evidence adds another dimension. Ketamine, a dissociative anesthetic used in surgery and increasingly in the treatment of depression, reliably produces out-of-body experiences in a dose-dependent manner. Low doses produce a sense of detachment from the body. Higher doses produce full disembodiment, the perception of floating above the body, observing it from outside, experiencing consciousness as unanchored from physical location. Carl Janssen, a psychiatrist and pharmacologist, documented hundreds of ketamine-induced OBEs and found that they share the core features of spontaneous OBEs and cardiac arrest NDEs: the sense of leaving the body, the perception of a tunnel or passage, encounters with other beings, and the overwhelming sense that the experience is real, more real, patients consistently report, than ordinary waking consciousness. The chemical produces the experience, but the experience does not feel chemical. It feels ontological, as though the chemical has removed a veil rather than created a hallucination. Rick Strassman, a psychiatrist at the University of New Mexico, conducted the first government-approved clinical studies of DMT, N, N-dimethyltryptamine in the 1990s and documented extraordinary reports from his 60 volunteers. DMT, which is produced endogenously by the human brain in small quantities, reliably produces intense visionary experiences, encounters with apparently autonomous beings, passage through geometrically complex spaces, the overwhelming sense of accessing a dimension of reality that is normally hidden from ordinary awareness. Many of Strassman's volunteers reported OBE-like experiences, the sense of leaving the body entirely and entering a space that felt more real and more fundamental than the physical world they had left behind. The endogenous production of DMT is significant. If the brain itself produces a molecule that can trigger out-of-body experiences, then the capacity for disembodiment is not an accident. It is built into the brain's chemistry. The question is why? Why would the brain produce a molecule that dislocates consciousness from the body? What adaptive function, what survival advantage would such a molecule provide? One possibility: the endogenous DMT system may be activated during extreme physiological stress, during near-death, during birth, during the moments of extreme crisis that the NDE literature documents. The OBE may not be a malfunction. It may be an emergency protocol, a system that the brain activates when the body's survival is in question, dislocating consciousness from the dying body and allowing it to continue operating from a perspective that is not bound to the failing hardware. This is speculative, but it is consistent with the evolutionary logic that the traditions have been describing for millennia. Consciousness is not identical to the body. The body is a vehicle, and under extreme conditions, the passenger can exit the vehicle temporarily, reversibly, and with the capacity to return. If consciousness is produced by the brain, if it is a computation, an emergent property, a byproduct of neural activity, then consciousness cannot leave the body because there is nowhere for it to go. The computation ceases when the hardware stops. But if consciousness is not produced by the brain, if it is received by the brain, mediated by the brain, channeled through the brain, but not identical to the brain's activity, then the possibility of consciousness existing independently of the body is not a violation of physics. It is a consequence of the nature of consciousness itself. This is the question we have been circling throughout these investigations. In the AI series, we found that consciousness may not be computation, that it may require something that digital computers lack. In the heart series, we found that the brain may not be the only organ of consciousness that the heart perceives, responds, and communicates in ways that suggest a distributed, not centralized, model of awareness. In the subconscious series, we found that consciousness may have access to information from beyond the senses, from the implicate order, from the collective unconscious, from sources that transcend the boundaries of the individual brain. And now, in this investigation, we confront the most radical possibility of all, that consciousness can exist outside the body entirely. The next part of this investigation will examine the quantum framework for non-local consciousness, the physics that could explain how consciousness might operate independently of the brain, how veridical perception during cardiac arrest might be physically possible, and how the tradition's descriptions of the soul's journey beyond the body might be something other than mythology. The evidence is not conclusive, the physics is speculative. But the question is real, and it may be the most important question that the science of consciousness has ever faced. The neuroscience of out-of-body experiences presents a paradox. On one hand, Blanke and Ehrsson demonstrate that the sense of bodily self-location is a brain construction, a model that can be disrupted, displaced, and manipulated through neural stimulation and sensory manipulation. This suggests that OBEs are products of the brain generated by the same neural machinery that normally generates the sense of being in the body, producing an alternative self-location when the normal integration fails. On the other hand, Van Lommel, Parnia, and Bohm document cases in which the disembodied perspective appears to access veridical information, accurate perceptions of events that the physical body could not have perceived, occurring during periods when the brain showed no measurable electrical activity. This suggests that something more than neural modeling may be occurring, that consciousness may genuinely access perspectives that transcend the brain's sensory apparatus. The paradox cannot be resolved by conventional neuroscience. Conventional neuroscience assumes that consciousness is produced by the brain, that every conscious experience is generated by neural activity, that no conscious experience can occur without neural activity, and that the content of consciousness is determined by the content of neural processing. If these assumptions are correct, then veridical perception during cardiac arrest is impossible because there is no neural activity to produce the perception. The patient cannot see the operating room from above because the visual cortex is not functioning. The patient cannot hear the surgeon's conversation because the auditory cortex is not processing. The patient cannot perceive anything because the brain, the organ that produces perception, is offline. And yet the patients report perceptions, and the perceptions are accurate. And the accuracy has been verified by medical personnel who were present during the events the patients describe. The quantum framework offers an alternative, not as a proven explanation but as a physically coherent hypothesis that can accommodate the evidence that conventional neuroscience cannot. The hypothesis is this: consciousness is not produced by the brain. Consciousness is received by the brain. The brain is not the generator of consciousness. It is the receiver, the instrument through which consciousness interacts with the physical world. The antenna that tunes into the signal of awareness, the interface between a non-local field of consciousness and the local, physical, spatially bounded body. And if consciousness is received rather than produced, then the failure of the receiver does not necessarily mean the failure of consciousness. When the television breaks, the broadcast does not stop. When the radio dies, the radio station does not go off the air. When the brain flatlines, consciousness, if it is a non-local field rather than a local computation, may continue. It may even perceive more clearly, freed from the filtering, the constraining, the narrowing that the brain normally imposes on the signal it receives. This is the filter theory of consciousness, and it has a distinguished intellectual pedigree. William James, the founder of American psychology, proposed in his 1898 Ingersoll lecture that the brain may function as a transmissive organ rather than a productive organ. Just as a prism transmits light without producing it, allowing certain wavelengths through while filtering others, the brain may transmit consciousness without producing it, allowing certain aspects of awareness through while filtering the rest. The brain does not create consciousness, it shapes it, it constrains it, it reduces an unlimited field of awareness to the narrow, focused, body-centered consciousness that is useful for navigating the physical world. And when the brain's filtering function is impaired by damage, by drugs, by electrical stimulation, by the extreme physiological crisis of cardiac arrest, the filter loosens. More consciousness gets through, the awareness expands, the boundaries dissolve, and the result is the out-of-body experience, not a malfunction of the brain, but a partial defiltering of consciousness. Aldous Huxley elaborated this view in The Doors of Perception, his 1954 account of his mescaline experience. Huxley proposed, following the French philosopher Henri Bergson, that the brain functions as a reducing valve, a mechanism that limits the totality of consciousness to the trickle that is useful for biological survival. Without the reducing valve, consciousness would be overwhelmed by the infinite information available in the universe. The brain's filtering function is adaptive. It allows the organism to focus on the information that is relevant to survival and to ignore the rest. But the filter can be opened by psychedelics, by meditation, by extreme physiological states, and when it opens, consciousness floods in. The ordinary boundaries of perception dissolve. The sense of being confined to the body dissolves, and consciousness, freed from the reducing valve's constraint, experiences reality in a mode that is wider, deeper, and less spatially bounded than ordinary waking awareness. The filter theory is not merely philosophical speculation. It makes specific, testable predictions that differ from the predictions of the production theory. The production theory predicts that brain damage should reduce consciousness. Less brain means less consciousness. The filter theory predicts that certain types of brain damage should increase consciousness, because reducing the filter allows more consciousness through. And the evidence from psychedelic research, from NDE studies, from meditation neuroscience is more consistent with the filter theory's predictions than with the production theories. Peter Fenwick, a neuropsychiatrist at King's College London and one of the most rigorous medical researchers in the NDE field, has documented cases of terminal lucidity that provide striking support for the filter theory. Terminal lucidity is the phenomenon in which patients with severe dementia or brain damage, patients who have not spoken, who have not recognized family members, who have shown no signs of higher cognitive function for months or years, suddenly become lucid in the hours or days before death. They speak coherently. They recognize loved ones. They recall memories that the disease had apparently destroyed. They have meaningful conversations. And then they die. The phenomenon has been documented in patients with Alzheimer's disease, brain tumors, strokes, and meningitis conditions that have physically destroyed the brain tissue that the production theory identifies as necessary for consciousness. The brain is devastated. The neurons are dead. The cortex is atrophied. And yet consciousness returns briefly, inexplicably, and with a clarity that the damaged brain cannot explain. Terminal lucidity is devastating for the production theory. If consciousness is produced by neural activity, then a brain with severe Alzheimer's, a brain with massive neuronal loss, widespread amyloid plaques, and neurofibrillary tangles cannot produce lucid, coherent, emotionally rich consciousness. The hardware is destroyed. The software cannot run, and yet it does in the hours before death, when the brain is at its most damaged. The filter theory provides a coherent explanation. The brain's filtering function is failing as the brain dies, and the failing filter allows more consciousness through, not less. The dementia was not destroying consciousness, it was blocking consciousness. And as the blockage fails, as the dying brain loses its capacity to maintain the filter, consciousness floods back. Alexander Batyany, a cognitive scientist at the University of Vienna, has conducted the largest systematic study of terminal lucidity, documenting over 100 cases from medical records, caregiver reports, and published literature. Batyany found that terminal lucidity occurs in approximately 5 to 10% of dementia patients, a minority, but a significant one. And the lucidity is not merely a subjective impression of family members who want to believe their loved one has returned. It is documented in medical records. It is observed by nurses and physicians. It involves specific, verifiable content names, memories, conversations that require cognitive capacities the damaged brain should not possess. Robin Carhart-Harris, a neuroscientist at Imperial College London, demonstrated a parallel finding with psilocybin, the active compound in psychedelic mushrooms. When participants were given psilocybin in an fMRI scanner, their subjective experience expanded dramatically vivid imagery, synesthesia, ego dissolution, the sense of accessing dimensions of reality normally hidden from awareness. Participants described the experience as one of the most meaningful of their lives, ranking it alongside the birth of a child or the death of a parent in personal significance. But the brain activity did not increase. It decreased. Specifically, activity in the default mode network, the brain system associated with self-referential processing, with the ego, with the narrative self, with the internal monologue that constantly narrates experience in terms of me and mine, decreased sharply. The more the default mode network decreased, the more intense the subjective experience became. The most intense subjective experiences, the most vivid, the most meaningful, the most consciousness expanding, corresponded to the greatest reductions in brain activity. Less brain activity produced more consciousness. This is exactly what the filter theory predicts and exactly the opposite of what the production theory predicts. Judson Brewer at Brown University independently confirmed the same pattern in meditation. Experienced meditators show reduced default mode network activity during deep practice, and the reduction correlates with the depth of the experience. The deepest meditative states, samadhi, satori, mystical union, correspond to the greatest suppression of the filtering system. The filter opens, consciousness expands, and the expansion is experienced as more real, not less as a revelation of what was always there, not as a hallucination projected onto nothing. The quantum physics of non-locality provides the physical framework within which the filter theory becomes scientifically coherent. Non-locality, the property of quantum mechanics demonstrated by Bell's theorem and confirmed by the aspect Delft and Zeilinger experiments that earned the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics, means that quantum systems can be correlated across any distance instantaneously. When two entangled photons are separated by any distance, meters, kilometers, the diameter of the Earth, a measurement on one instantly correlates with the state of the other. There is no signal. There is no transmission. There is no time delay. The correlation is not mediated by any known force or field. It is a feature of the entangled state itself, a connection that transcends spatial separation as completely as it transcends our classical intuitions about how the world works. Non-locality is not a hypothesis. It is not an interpretation. It is a proven feature of quantum mechanics demonstrated in thousands of experiments, confirmed to statistical certainties of billions to one, certified by the Nobel Committee, and accepted by every physicist working in the field. The universe is non-local. Whatever else we do not know about quantum mechanics, we know this. Spatial separation does not prevent correlation. Distance does not prevent connection, and the boundaries between here and there are not the absolute barriers that classical physics assumed. If consciousness is a quantum phenomenon as Penrose, Hameroff, and Stapp argue, then consciousness may be inherently non-local, not confined to the brain, not bounded by the skull, not limited to the spatial location of the body. The brain may be the local expression of a non-local field, the point at which the non-local field of consciousness intersects with the local, physical, spatially bounded body. And the out-of-body experience may be the subjective experience of consciousness returning to its non-local nature, freed, temporarily, from the local constraint that the brain normally imposes. David Bohm's implicate order makes this framework explicit. In the implicate order, everything is enfolded into everything else. There are no separate objects. There are no isolated locations. Every point in space contains information about every other point, and consciousness, if it participates in the implicate order, if it is a feature of the deep structure of reality rather than an emergent property of localized brain, activity is not confined to any particular location. It is everywhere. It is always everywhere. And the sense of being in a body, the sense that consciousness is located behind the eyes, between the ears, inside the skull, is the explicate order's projection of an implicate reality that is inherently non-local. The out-of-body experience, in Bohm's framework, is not consciousness leaving the body. It is consciousness returning to the implicate order, experiencing briefly the non-local nature that is its fundamental condition. The body does not contain consciousness. The body constrains consciousness, reducing its natural non-locality to a specific point in space, filtering its natural omnipresence to a narrow beam, focused through the eyes and ears and skin of a particular body. The OBE is the relaxation of this constraint. The filter opens, the constraint loosens, and consciousness, freed from the body's spatial limitation, experiences itself as it fundamentally is unbounded, non-local, and free. Henry Stapp's quantum framework adds a mechanistic dimension. In Stapp's formulation, consciousness interacts with the brain through process 1, the choice of measurement that collapses the quantum superposition of neural states into a definite outcome. Process 1 does not require spatial proximity. The choice of measurement in quantum mechanics is not a local operation. It is a non-local operation that affects the entire quantum system instantaneously, regardless of spatial separation. If consciousness performs process 1, if it is the agent that chooses the measurement and collapses the wave function, then consciousness is not spatially confined to the brain. It is the non-local agent that interacts with the brain from outside the brain's spatial boundaries. This has a direct implication for the OBE. If consciousness is a non-local agent that normally interacts with the brain through process 1, then the interaction can, in principle, be disrupted by cardiac arrest, by extreme physiological stress, by the disruption of the neural systems that mediate the interaction. When the interaction is disrupted, consciousness does not cease. It continues, but without the brain's spatial constraint, without the body's sensory filtering, without the normal mechanism that anchors non-local awareness to a specific physical location. And the result, the subjective experience of consciousness, freed from its neural anchor, is the out-of-body experience. Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose's Orch OR theory adds the biological specificity that Stapp's framework lacks. In Orch OR, consciousness arises from quantum processes in microtubules, the crystalline protein structures within neurons. The quantum superpositions in microtubules undergo objective reduction, self-collapse at a threshold determined by quantum gravity. Each objective reduction event is a moment of conscious experience, and the quantum information processed by the microtubules is not confined to the microtubules themselves. It is connected to the quantum vacuum, to the Planck scale geometry of space-time itself through the gravitational self-energy of the superposed states. Hameroff has speculated, and he has been explicit, that this is speculation, not established science, that when the brain dies, the quantum information in the microtubules does not disappear. It dissipates into the quantum vacuum, into the space-time geometry, into the Planck scale foam, into the implicate order. The information is not destroyed. Quantum information cannot be destroyed. This is a mathematical consequence of the unitarity of quantum mechanics, the same principle we invoked in the karma investigation. The unitarity principle states that the total information content of a closed quantum system is conserved over time. Information can be transformed, it can be redistributed, it can be scrambled beyond any practical possibility of retrieval, but it cannot be annihilated. The quantum information that constituted the person's conscious experience is preserved, distributed, delocalized, scrambled perhaps, but mathematically intact. The black hole information paradox, one of the deepest problems in theoretical physics, revolves around this very principle. Stephen Hawking initially proposed that information falling into a black hole is destroyed when the black hole evaporates. But this contradicts unitarity, and after decades of debate, the physics community has largely concluded that information is preserved, even in the extreme conditions of a black hole's event horizon. If information survives the most extreme physical conditions in the universe, the infinite curvature of space-time at a singularity, then the claim that information survives the death of the brain is, by comparison, modest. The brain is not a black hole. Its conditions are not extreme by the standards of physics. And if unitarity holds, if information is conserved, then the quantum information of consciousness is preserved when the brain dies. The question is not whether the information survives. The question is whether the information remains organized, whether the patterns that constitute a person's conscious identity persist in a coherent form after the brain's microtubules cease to sustain them. And the near-death experience, the tunnel, the light, the life review, the out-of-body perspective may be the subjective experience of this transition. The quantum information of consciousness dispersing from the localized microtubules into the non-local quantum vacuum. If the person is resuscitated, if the heart restarts, the blood flows, the microtubules resume their quantum processes, then the quantum information returns. It relocalizes, it recondenses into the microtubule network, and consciousness resumes its normal, body-centered, spatially constrained mode of operation. The person wakes up. They remember the experience. They report the tunnel, the light, the life review. They describe accurate perceptions of events that occurred while their brain was flatlined. And the accuracy of their perceptions is explained in this framework not by residual brain activity, but by the non-local nature of the quantum information that constituted their consciousness during the period of cardiac arrest. The information was everywhere. It could access any perspective. It was not confined to the body. And the perceptions it generated were not limited by the body's sensory apparatus. The quantum vacuum, the ground state of the quantum field, is the physical entity that could mediate non-local consciousness. As we explored in the subconscious investigation, the quantum vacuum is not empty. It contains zero-point energy, virtual particles, and if the holographic principle is correct, the complete information content of the universe encoded on the boundary of space-time. Edgar Mitchell's quantum hologram hypothesis proposed that the brain accesses information stored in the quantum vacuum through quantum resonance. If this is correct, then the out-of-body experience may involve a shift in the mode of access from the normal, brain-mediated, sensory-filtered mode to a direct, unmediated mode in which consciousness accesses the quantum vacuum without the brain's intervention. The holographic principle proposed by Gerard Hooft and Leonard Susskind, and supported by Juan Maldacena adds, CFT correspondence states that the information content of any volume of space can be described by a theory on the boundary of that space. The three-dimensional interior is a projection of the two-dimensional boundary. The bulk is a hologram of the surface. If consciousness is associated with the information content of the brain, and if the holographic principle applies to the brain as it applies to all physical systems, then the consciousness associated with the brain is not fundamentally three-dimensional. It is a projection from a boundary, a holographic image generated by information encoded on a surface. And a holographic image is inherently non-local. Every point in the hologram contains information about the entire image. Damage any part, and the whole image persists at reduced resolution. This is why Lashley could not find the engram, the specific location where memories are stored despite decades of searching. Memories are not stored at specific locations. They are stored holographically distributed across the entire neural network, with every part containing information about the whole. And if consciousness is holographic, if it is a non-local projection from a boundary, then the sense of being confined to a specific location in the brain is an illusion of the projection. The consciousness is everywhere on the boundary. It merely appears to be localized in the interior. The retrocausality dimension adds a temporal component to non-local consciousness. If consciousness is not confined to a specific location in space, if non-locality is a feature of its quantum nature, then consciousness may also not be confined to a specific location in time. The Life Review reported in NDEs the simultaneous perception of all moments of a person's life from multiple perspectives in a single experiential moment is consistent with a consciousness that has been freed from temporal as well as spatial constraint. In the block universe, the relativistic model of space-time in which past, present, and future coexist as a four-dimensional structure, all moments exist simultaneously. The perception of temporal flow, the sense that time passes, that the past is gone and the future has not yet arrived, is a feature of localized, brain-mediated consciousness. It is part of the filter, and when the filter is removed, when consciousness is delocalized by cardiac arrest, by the dispersal of quantum information into the vacuum, the temporal filter may dissolve along with the spatial filter. The result is the Life Review, the perception of all moments at once, from all perspectives, in a single experiential instant. Not a replay, a revelation. The simultaneous perception of an entire life as a unified, four-dimensional structure. The connection to the heart investigation is significant. McCraty's prestimulus research demonstrated that the heart responds to future emotionally significant stimuli before they are randomly selected, suggesting that the heart has access to information from the future. If the heart's electromagnetic field is coupled to the quantum vacuum, and if the quantum vacuum contains holographic information about all events, past and future, then the heart's prestimulus response is a localized, body-mediated expression of the same non-local access that the NDE Life Review represents in its delocalized, defiltered form. The heart accesses future information through the brain's filtering system, and the access is partial, subtle, below the threshold of awareness. The NDE Life Review accesses all temporal information without the filtering system, and the access is total, overwhelming, and experienced as the most real event of the person's life. It is essential to state clearly what is established and what is speculative in this picture. Established. Out-of-body experiences can be produced by neural stimulation and sensory manipulation. Blanke, Ehrsson. Established. Some cardiac arrest patients report accurate perceptions of events during periods of no measurable brain activity. Van Lommel, Parnia, Bohm. Established. Psychedelic-induced expansion of consciousness correlates with decreased, rather than increased, brain activity. Carhart-Harris. Established. Quantum mechanics is non-local. Bell, Aspect, Zeilinger. Established. Quantum information is conserved. Unitarity. Speculative. The filter theory of consciousness. Speculative. The dispersal of quantum information from microtubules into the quantum vacuum during cardiac arrest. Speculative. The holographic nature of consciousness. Speculative. The temporal delocalization of consciousness during NDEs. Speculative. The quantum vacuum as the medium of non-local awareness. The speculation is grounded in established physics. It is consistent with established evidence. It provides coherent explanations for phenomena that conventional neuroscience cannot explain, but it has not been experimentally confirmed. The honest position is, non-local consciousness is physically possible, theoretically coherent, and supported by suggestive evidence. It is not proven, and yet, the traditions, every major contemplative tradition in human history, describe exactly this. They describe consciousness as fundamentally non-local. They describe the body as a vehicle, a container, a temporary dwelling for an awareness that existed before the body was born and that will continue after the body dies. They describe practices for loosening the body's grip on consciousness, for partially defiltering awareness while still alive. for experiencing the non-local nature of consciousness without the extreme intervention of cardiac arrest or psychedelic drugs. And they describe the out-of-body experience not as a pathological anomaly, but as a natural capacity, a feature of consciousness that can be cultivated, trained, and used for specific, spiritual, and practical purposes. The next part of this investigation will enter the traditions and hear their descriptions of the soul's journey beyond the body, from the shamanic spirit flight to the Christian rapture, from the Buddhist Bardo navigation to the Islamic Isra and Miraj, from the Hindu subtle body to the Dowist immortal spirit. The descriptions are detailed, consistent across cultures, and in light of the quantum framework, we have assembled potentially more than mythology. They may be maps of a territory that the physics of non-local consciousness is only beginning to chart. The traditions did not discover out-of-body experiences in a laboratory. They discovered them in caves, in deserts, in forests, in temples, in the quiet hours before dawn when the boundary between waking and sleeping thins and the mind, freed from the daytime's sensory bombardment, turns inward and encounters something that the daytime mind cannot reach. The discovery was not theoretical. It was experiential, the direct, first-hand perception of consciousness operating beyond the boundaries of the physical body. And the discovery was not rare. It was universal. Every major contemplative tradition on every inhabited continent developed practices for inducing, navigating, and interpreting out-of-body states, practices refined through millennia of experiential investigation, transmitted through unbroken lineages of practitioners, and described with a consistency across cultures that is difficult to explain as coincidence, and that becomes increasingly significant in light of the quantum framework we have assembled. The shamanic traditions provide the oldest and most widespread technology for out-of-body experience. Shamanism is not a single religion. It is a practice, a set of techniques for entering non-ordinary states of consciousness and using those states for healing, divination, and communication with dimensions of reality that ordinary consciousness cannot access. The practice is found on every continent: in Siberia, in the Amazon, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Australia, in Korea, in Scandinavia, in the Americas. And the core of the practice is the same everywhere. The shaman enters a trance state, typically through rhythmic drumming at 4 to 4.5 beats per second. As Maxfield documented, and experiences their consciousness, leaving their body and travelling to other realms. Mircea Eliade, the Romanian historian of religions, who produced the definitive scholarly study of shamanism, described the shamanic journey as the archaic technique of ecstasy. The word ecstasy comes from the Greek ekstasis, standing outside oneself. The shaman literally stands outside their body. They perceive themselves from above. They travel through a tunnel, through a passage, through a hole in the sky, or a crack in the earth, to other realms that the shamanic traditions describe with remarkable consistency. An upper world associated with celestial beings, ancestors, and spiritual guidance, a lower world associated with animal spirits, earth energies, and the retrieval of lost soul parts, and the ordinary world seen from a non-ordinary perspective. The shaman interacts with beings in these realms, receives information, performs healings, retrieves lost energy, and then returns to the body, typically through the same passage by which they departed. The consistency across shamanic cultures is striking. Michael Harner, an anthropologist who studied shamanic practices in the Amazon, in North America, and in Scandinavia, documented that shamans from cultures with no historical contact describe the same geography of non-ordinary reality, the same three-layered cosmology, the same passage between worlds, the axis mundi, a tree, a mountain, a pillar, a ladder, the same types of beings encountered in each realm, the same techniques for navigation and return. The consistency is not cultural, it is structural, as though the shamans from different cultures are exploring the same territory and drawing the same map. And the map, the three-layered cosmology, the axis mundi, the passage between worlds, corresponds, in its essential structure, to the NDE reports that Van Lommel, Parnia, and Grayson have documented: the tunnel, the light, the encounters with non-physical beings, the perception of reality from a perspective that transcends the body's spatial location. The shamanic journey is not a passive experience. It is a skill learned through years of apprenticeship, practiced under the guidance of experienced shamans, refined through thousands of repetitions. The apprentice shaman learns to enter the trance state reliably, to navigate the non-ordinary realms accurately, to interact with the beings encountered without losing coherence or control, and to return to the body safely. The training is rigorous, the failure rate is high, and the standards are empirical. The shaman's competence is judged not by theological correctness, but by results. Can the shaman heal? Can the shaman find lost objects? Can the shaman provide accurate information about distant events? The shamanic tradition evaluates its practitioners the way science evaluates its theories, by outcomes. And the fact that the tradition has survived for tens of thousands of years present in the oldest known human cultures, persisting through every historical upheaval, adapting to every cultural context, suggests that the outcomes have been sufficient to justify the practice. The specificity of the shamanic geography is remarkable. The Yakut shamans of Siberia describe 9 upper worlds and 9 lower worlds, connected by the world tree, a cosmic axis that the shaman climbs or descends to reach the desired realm. The Huichol shamans of Mexico describe 5 cardinal directions, each associated with a specific color, a specific animal spirit, and a specific type of healing energy. The Sami Noidi of Scandinavia describe 3 worlds connected by a sacred mountain. The Australian Aboriginal Ngangkuri describe the Dreamtime, a parallel reality that underlies and generates the ordinary world, accessible through trance, through sacred sites, and through the songlines that map the landscape as simultaneously physical and spiritual geography. Despite these cultural differences in detail, the structure is shared. Upper world, celestial, luminous, associated with wisdom and guidance. Lower world, subterranean, earthy, associated with primal energy and ancestral power. Middle world, the ordinary world perceived from a non-ordinary perspective, the shaman seeing through walls, traveling instantly to distant locations, perceiving the energetic dimension of physical reality that ordinary consciousness screens out. 3 worlds, 1 axis. The same map drawn independently on every continent, by cultures separated by oceans and millennia, using different symbols to mark the same territory. Eduardo Luna, an anthropologist who spent decades studying ayahuasca shamanism in the Amazon, documented that the icaros of Amazonian shamans, the specific songs, sung during healing ceremonies, are not merely musical accompaniment, they are navigational tools. Each icaro corresponds to a specific realm, a specific type of healing energy, a specific class of spirit beings. The shaman selects the icaro the way a pilot selects a radio frequency to tune into a specific dimension of the non-ordinary landscape. The music is not decorative. It is functional, a technology for navigating the out-of-body state that connects directly to everything we discovered in the music investigation about entrainment, resonance, and the capacity of specific frequencies to shift the brain into specific states of consciousness. The Hindu tradition maps the out-of-body experience through the concept of the subtle body, sukshma, sharira, and sasi, provides the most detailed description of its anatomy in any tradition. The subtle body is not the physical body. It is an energetic body, a body composed not of flesh and bone, but of prana, vital energy, of nadi, energy channels, and of chakra energy centers. The subtle body interpenetrates the physical body during waking life, occupying the same space, following the same form, but operating at a level of reality that physical instruments cannot detect. And the subtle body can separate from the physical body during sleep, during deep meditation, during the transition of death, and travel independently. The anatomy of the subtle body is described with a precision that suggests centuries of systematic investigation. The nadis, the energy channels, number 72,000, according to the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. 3 are primary. The Ida, associated with lunar energy, the left nostril, the parasympathetic nervous system, and cooling, calming functions. The Pingala, associated with solar energy, the right nostril, the sympathetic nervous system, and heating, activating functions, and the Sushumna, the central channel, running along the spine, associated with the deepest states of consciousness and the Kundalini energy that the yoga tradition describes as the dormant creative power coiled at the base of the spine. The 7 chakras from Muladhara at the base of the spine to Sahasrara at the crown of the head are energy centers where the nadis converge, each associated with specific psychological functions, specific emotional qualities, and specific states of consciousness. The out-of-body experience, in the Hindu framework, occurs when prana, the vital energy that normally animates the physical body, is concentrated in the subtle body and withdrawn from the gross body. The physical body enters a state of deep stillness, reduced metabolism, reduced breathing, reduced heart rate, while the subtle body, now fully energized, separates and travels. The separation is not a metaphor. It is a phenomenological event described by practitioners as the perception of a second body rising out of the physical body, connected to it by a cord of energy, the silver cord that appears in many OBE traditions, and capable of traveling to distant locations, to other planes of reality, and to states of consciousness that the embodied mind cannot access. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the foundational text of classical yoga, composed approximately 2,000 years ago, describe a specific technique for projecting consciousness out of the body. The technique is called Parasharira Pravesha, entering another body, and it is listed among the siddhis, the supernatural powers that arise as byproducts of advanced yogic practice. Patanjali does not present the technique as a goal of yoga. He presents it as a side effect, a capacity that naturally develops as the practitioner's mastery of concentration, dharana, meditation, dhyana, and absorption, samadhi, deepens. The out-of-body experience, in Patanjali's framework, is not the destination. It is a signpost evidence that consciousness is becoming less bound to the physical body, less constrained by the sensory apparatus, less dependent on the neural hardware that ordinary consciousness requires. The Mandukya Upanishad, which we encountered in the music investigation, describes 4 states of consciousness: waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and turiya. The dreaming state, taijasa, is the state in which consciousness operates through the subtle body rather than the physical body. In waking, consciousness is bound to the physical body, perceiving through the physical senses, constrained by the physical body's location in space. In dreaming, consciousness is freed from the physical body. It operates through the subtle body, perceiving through subtle senses, unconstrained by physical location. The dreamer travels. The dreamer perceives distant places, past events, future possibilities. The dreamer encounters beings who are not physically present. And the dreamer does all this while the physical body lies motionless in bed, because the consciousness has shifted from the gross body to the subtle body, from the physical vehicle to the energetic vehicle, from the spatially constrained to the spatially free. The concept of the astral body, a term used in Western esoteric traditions but derived from Hindu and Buddhist sources, describes the same vehicle with different terminology. The astral body is the energetic double of the physical body, a body of light, of energy, of consciousness that can separate from the physical form and travel independently. The theosophical tradition developed by Helena Blavatsky and Annie Besant in the late 19th century, drawing on Hindu and Buddhist sources, popularized the term astral projection for the deliberate, controlled separation of the astral body from the physical body. And the technique they described, relaxation of the physical body, withdrawal of sensory awareness, concentration of consciousness in the energetic body, and deliberate projection of that consciousness out of the physical form, maps, in its essential structure, onto the physiological changes that Blanke documented during electrically induced OBEs. The relaxation reduces proprioceptive input. The withdrawal of sensory awareness reduces visual and auditory input. The concentration disrupts the TPJ's integration of multisensory signals. And the projection, the subjective experience of consciousness leaving the body, is the TPJ's alternative solution to the integration failure. The esoteric technique and the neuroscience converge on the same mechanism described in different languages but operating through the same neural architecture. The Buddhist tradition describes the out-of-body experience through two complementary frameworks. The doctrine of the Manomaya Kaya, the mind-made body, and the elaborate cartography of the bardo states described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The Manomaya Kaya appears in the Pali Canon, the earliest Buddhist scriptures, as a body created by the mind, capable of traveling independently of the physical body, possessing all the senses of the physical body, but unconstrained by physical limitations. The Buddha himself is described as projecting a mind-made body, traveling in subtle form to the heavenly realms to teach the Dharma to the gods. And the capacity is not limited to the Buddha. It is listed among the abhina, the higher knowledges that arise from advanced meditation practice. The fifth abhina is the divine eye, the capacity to perceive events at distant locations, beyond the reach of the physical senses. The third abhina is iddhi psychic power, which includes the capacity to project the mind-made body, to travel through walls and mountains, to appear in multiple locations simultaneously, and to fly through the air. These capacities are described not as miracles, but as natural consequences of advanced concentration practice, byproducts of a mind that has been trained to operate independently of the sensory constraints that bind ordinary consciousness. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo Thodol, literally liberation through hearing during the intermediate state, provides the most detailed map of the out-of-body journey that any tradition has produced. The text describes three bardo states, intermediate states between death and rebirth through which consciousness passes after leaving the physical body. The first bardo, the bardo of dying, is the moment of death itself, when consciousness separates from the body and encounters what the text describes as the clear light of reality, a luminous, infinite, empty awareness that is the fundamental nature of mind, normally concealed by the body's sensory activity and the ego's self-referential processing. This is the same luminous awareness that the Hesychast tradition calls the uncreated light, that the Hindu tradition calls the light of the Atman, and that the NDE literature describes as the bright light at the end of the tunnel. The traditions converge on the same perceptual event, an encounter with a luminous awareness that is perceived as more real and more fundamental than ordinary waking consciousness. The second bardo, the bardo of Dharmata, is the period immediately following death, during which consciousness encounters a series of visions, peaceful and wrathful deities, brilliant lights of different colors, sounds and sensations of extraordinary intensity. The Tibetan tradition interprets these visions not as external encounters but as projections of the consciousness itself, the mind's own nature appearing in visual form, the archetypal patterns of the collective unconscious, in Jungian terms, manifesting as deities and demons. The visions are not hallucinations, They are the mind's deep structure becoming visible, the same deep structure that Jung documented through dream analysis, that Pauli perceived in his quaternion dreams, that the mandalas of every tradition represent in visual form. The bardo of Dharmata is the implicate order unfolding into experiential imagery, the deep structure of reality presenting itself to a consciousness that has been freed from the body's filtering system. The third bardo, the bardo of becoming, is the period during which consciousness, having failed to recognize its own nature in the clear light and the visions, moves toward rebirth. Consciousness in this bardo possesses a mental body similar to the Manomaya Kaya that can travel instantaneously to any location, pass through physical objects, and perceive events in the physical world without being perceived itself. The mental body is driven by karma, by the accumulated tendencies, the habitual patterns, the dispositional seeds stored in the alaya vijnana toward the circumstances of the next rebirth. And the text provides specific instructions for navigating this bardo, for recognizing the visions as projections of the mind, for maintaining awareness and equanimity, for choosing the rebirth deliberately rather than being driven to it by karmic compulsion. The instructions are practical, they are specific, and they presuppose that consciousness survives the death of the body, that it operates independently, with perception, with agency, with the capacity to choose in a state that is unconstrained by the physical body's limitations. Christianity describes out-of-body experiences through the lens of divine encounter as events in which the human soul is temporarily separated from the body by divine action and granted access to spiritual realities that the embodied soul cannot perceive. The most explicit biblical account is Paul's description in 2 Corinthians. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible things, things that no one is permitted to tell. Paul is describing a classic OBE, and he is honest about the phenomenology. He does not know whether his consciousness left his body or whether his body was transported with him. He knows only that he accessed a dimension of reality, the third heaven, paradise, that is not accessible through ordinary embodied consciousness. And the experience was so profound, so far beyond the capacity of language to convey, that he cannot communicate what he heard. Inexpressible things. The same description that NDE experiences consistently provide the overwhelming sense that the experience exceeds the capacity of human language to describe. The visionary tradition in Christianity, from Ezekiel's throne chariot vision to John's revelation, from Hildegard von Bingen's cosmic visions to Teresa of Avila's interior castle, from the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing to the Eastern Orthodox tradition of Theoria, describes a continuum of experiences in which consciousness transcends its ordinary bodily limitations and accesses spiritual realities. Some of these experiences are described as occurring in the body. The visionary remains physically present, while perceiving spiritual realities superimposed on or replacing ordinary sensory experience. Others are described as occurring out of the body. The visionary's consciousness is transported to another realm, another dimension, another level of reality. And the tradition does not always distinguish clearly between the two, because the distinction from the experiential perspective is not always clear. The visionary perceives something that transcends ordinary reality. Whether the transcendence involves the consciousness leaving the body or the body being transparent to spiritual reality is a question that the tradition leaves open, much as Paul left it open in his account of the third heaven. The Desert Fathers, whom we have encountered in multiple investigations, developed specific practices for what they called nepsis, vigilance, watchfulness, the sustained awareness of the interior movements of the soul. The practice of nepsis involves a progressive withdrawal of consciousness from the external senses. a systematic de-identification with the body's sensory apparatus, a turning of awareness inward, a descent from the surface of the mind into its depths. The Desert Fathers described stages of this descent from the active, discursive surface to the quiet, luminous depths where the prayer of the heart operates. And at the deepest levels, the Desert Fathers reported experiences that map directly onto the OBE literature. The perception of the body from outside, the sense of consciousness operating independently of sensory input, the encounter with a luminous reality that transcends the categories of ordinary experience. They did not call these experiences out of body. They called them contemplation, theoria, the direct perception of divine reality. But the phenomenology is the same. Consciousness freed from its ordinary bodily constraint, perceiving from a perspective that transcends the body's spatial location. The Islamic tradition contains what may be the most famous out-of-body journey in any Abrahamic religion, the Isra and Miraj, the night journey and ascension of the Prophet Muhammad. According to Islamic tradition, Muhammad was transported from the sacred mosque in Mecca to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the Isra, and from there ascended through the 7 heavens to the presence of God, the Miraj. At each heaven, Muhammad encountered a previous prophet, Adam at the first heaven, Jesus and John the Baptist at the second, Joseph at the third, Idris at the fourth, Aaron at the fifth, Moses at the sixth, and Abraham at the seventh. Beyond the 7th heaven, Muhammad entered the divine presence and received instructions, including the prescription for the 5 daily prayers. The Isra and Miraj has been debated within Islamic theology for 14 centuries. Was the journey physical or spiritual? Did Muhammad travel in the body or in the spirit? The majority of mainstream Sunni scholarship holds that the journey was both physical and spiritual, that Muhammad's body and soul were transported together. But a significant minority, including some early Muslim scholars and many Sufi interpreters, argue that the journey was spiritual, that Muhammad's consciousness, his ruh, his spirit travelled while his body remained in Mecca. This is an out-of-body journey described at the founding of a major world religion, and the debate about its nature mirrors, with remarkable precision, the debate that modern neuroscience is having about the nature of OBEs. Is the experience a neural event, consciousness generated by the brain, remaining in the body while producing the illusion of travel, or a genuine separation, consciousness, operating independently of the body, accessing perspectives and information that the body cannot reach? The Sufi tradition developed the Miraj into a template for spiritual practice. The Sufi concept of the Miraji Ruhani, the spiritual ascension, describes a journey that every sincere seeker can undertake, the progressive elevation of consciousness from the lower levels of the nafs, the ego, the appetitive self, through increasingly subtle and luminous levels of awareness until the practitioner reaches fana, the annihilation of the self in the divine presence. The journey is not physical. It is not a journey through space. It is a journey through levels of consciousness from the dense, body-centered, ego-dominated awareness of ordinary life to the luminous, non-local, ego-dissolved awareness that the Sufi tradition identifies as the true nature of the soul. And the practices that facilitate the journey, dhikra, muraqabah, sema, are the same practices we have documented throughout these investigations. Rhythmic chanting that entrains brain waves, contemplation that quiets the default mode network, movement that disrupts the TPJ's self-location computation. The Sufi ascension is not metaphorical. It is a specific, structured, reproducible technique for altering the brain's self-location system and experiencing consciousness from a perspective that transcends the body's spatial constraint. The Dowist tradition adds a distinctive perspective. Through the concept of the Yang Shen, the Yang spirit body, that advanced practitioners cultivate through decades of internal alchemy practice. The Taoist internal alchemy tradition Needon describes a systematic process of refining the body's energies from Jing, essence, to Qi, vital energy, to Shen, spirit, and from Shen to Zhu, emptiness. At the most advanced stages, the practitioner is said to be capable of projecting the Yang Shen, a body of pure spirit, luminous, capable of independent action, visible to others, and able to operate at any distance from the physical body. The tradition describes specific signs of progress, internal heat, spontaneous movements, the perception of light within the body, the hearing of internal sounds that correspond with striking precision to the physiological effects that modern research associates with advanced meditation practice, altered autonomic function, involuntary motor phenomena, biophotonic activity, and the internal sounds that the Hindu Nada yoga tradition describes as the Anahata Nada. The Taoist tradition also preserves accounts of masters who demonstrated the Yang Shen's independence from the physical body, appearing in two places simultaneously, traveling to distant locations in spirit while the body remained in the meditation hall, and communicating with disciples who were geographically remote. These accounts are hagiographic, they are stories told about revered masters by their followers, and they are not subject to independent verification, but they are consistent across Taoist lineages, consistent with the shamanic and Hindu and Buddhist descriptions, and consistent with the quantum framework of non-local consciousness that we have assembled. The convergence across traditions is structural, not merely thematic. Every tradition describes 1. Consciousness that can operate independently of the physical body. 2. A vehicle or body of consciousness that separates from the physical form the subtle body, the mental body, the soul, the spirit, the astral body. 3. A geography of non-physical reality, heavens, bardos, upper and lower worlds, interior castles, the third heaven that consciousness explores when freed from bodily constraint. 4. Specific techniques for inducing the separation. Drumming, meditation, prayer, breathing practices, sensory withdrawal. 5. Encounters with non-physical beings, ancestors, deities, angels, spirit guides, the divine presence that provide information, guidance, and healing. And 6. A return to the body. The consciousness re-enters the physical form. The ordinary sense of self-location is restored, and the experiencer retains memories of the journey. 6 features, 6 structural elements, present in every tradition, independently developed, across every continent, across every century. The probability that this convergence is coincidental, that dozens of independent cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, all fabricated the same 6-element structure through imagination alone, is vanishingly small. The more parsimonious explanation is that the traditions are describing a real phenomenon, an experience that the human brain is capable of producing, that specific techniques reliably induce, and that the quantum framework of non-local consciousness may, for the first time in history, begin to explain. The final part of this investigation will put it all together: the neuroscience, the quantum physics, the traditions, and address the question that every human being, in their most private and most honest moments, has asked: is there a part of me that is not confined to this body? And if so, what does that mean for how I live, how I die, and what I am? 3 investigations. 3 independent approaches to the most intimate and most terrifying question a human being can ask: is there a part of me that is not confined to this body? And the answer from the neuroscience, from the quantum physics, from every major contemplative tradition in human history is possibly. Not certainly, not proven beyond doubt, but possibly in a way that is consistent with established physics, supported by suggestive evidence, described with structural precision across every culture, and coherent with everything we have discovered across the entire arc of these investigations about the nature of consciousness, the architecture of reality, and the relationship between the observer and the observed. The neuroscience established the paradox. Blanke demonstrated that the sense of being in a body is a construction, a model built by the temporoparietal junction from the integration of visual, vestibular, and proprioceptive information. Ehrsson demonstrated that this model is fragile, that the rubber hand illusion, the full body illusion, and the mannequin illusion can displace the sense of self from the physical body to a substitute within seconds. The sense of being in here is not a fundamental feature of consciousness. It is a computation, and the computation can be altered. But the neuroscience also established that some out-of-body experiences appear to access veridical information. Van Lommel's prospective study documented near-death experiences in 18% of cardiac arrest survivors, experiences that included accurate perceptions of events during periods of no measurable brain activity. Parnia's AWARE study documented a patient who provided accurate, verified details of his resuscitation during 3 minutes of confirmed cardiac arrest. Bohm documented Pam Reynolds' accurate perceptions during hypothermic cardiac arrest, perceptions that occurred while her eyes were taped shut, her ears were plugged with 100-decibel clicks, and her brain showed no electrical activity by any measure. And Grayson documented the cross-cultural consistency of NDE features: the tunnel, the light, the deceased relatives, the life review, the out-of-body perspective across cultures that had no contact with each other and no shared framework for interpreting the experience. The paradox is genuine. The experience is real, produced by identifiable neural mechanisms. But some experiences contain information that the neural mechanisms cannot explain. The TPJ model can account for the phenomenology, the sense of floating above the body, the visual perspective from above, the feeling of separation. It cannot account for the veridical perception, the accurate report of events that the physical senses could not have detected. And the gap between what the neural model explains and what the veridical perception requires is the gap that the quantum framework attempts to bridge. The quantum physics provided the bridge, speculative, but physically coherent. The filter theory proposes that the brain does not produce consciousness, but receives it, constraining a non-local field of awareness to the narrow, body-centered, sensory-filtered consciousness that is useful for biological survival. Terminal lucidity supports this patience with devastated brains, recovering full consciousness before death, as though the filter is failing and more awareness is getting through. Carhart-Harris's psilocybin research supports this. The most intense subjective experiences corresponding to the greatest decreases in brain activity, specifically in the default mode network that maintains the ego and the sense of bodily self-location. Non-locality, proven by Bell's theorem, confirmed by the Nobel Prize-winning experiments of Aspect, Clauser, and Zeilinger, establishes that quantum systems can be correlated across any distance instantaneously. If consciousness is a quantum phenomenon, it may be inherently non-local, not confined to the brain, not bounded by the skull, not limited to the spatial coordinates of the body. The brain may be the local expression of a non-local field, and the out-of-body experience may be the subjective experience of consciousness returning to its non-local nature when the brain's constraining. Function is disrupted. Bohm's implicate order provides the ontological framework. In the implicate order, everything is enfolded into everything else. There are no separate locations. There are no isolated events. Consciousness, if it participates in the implicate order, is everywhere and always. The sense of being in a specific body at a specific location is the explicate order's projection of an implicate reality that is inherently non-local. The OBE is the relaxation of the explicate constraint consciousness, experiencing its implicate nature, freed temporarily from the spatial limitation that the body normally imposes. Hameroff and Penrose's Orch OR theory provides the biological specificity. Consciousness arises from quantum processes in microtubules. When the brain dies, the quantum information in the microtubules does not disappear. Quantum information is conserved by the unitarity of quantum mechanics. The information dissipates into the quantum vacuum, into the Planck scale geometry of space-time. The near-death experience may be the subjective experience of this transition consciousness delocalizing from the microtubules into the non-local quantum field. And if the person is resuscitated, the information relocalizes, recondensing into the microtubule network, restoring body-centered consciousness and leaving the person with memories of the non-local state. The traditions provided the map. Shamanism describes three worlds connected by an axis, mundi, a cosmology present on every continent, refined through tens of thousands of years of practice, navigated by practitioners who are evaluated by empirical outcomes rather than theological orthodoxy. Hinduism describes the subtle body, the energetic vehicle that separates from the physical body during sleep, meditation, and death. Composed of prana, nadi, and chakra, described with an anatomical precision that suggests centuries of systematic investigation. Buddhism describes the manomaya kaya, and the bardo states the mind-made body that operates independently of the physical form, traveling through intermediate states between death and rebirth, navigable through the skills developed in dream yoga and meditation practice. Christianity describes the soul's journey to the third heaven, Paul's experience of being caught up to a dimension of reality that transcends ordinary embodied consciousness, accompanied by the inexpressible perception of truths that language cannot convey. Islam describes the Isra and Miraj, the prophet's journey through 7 heavens to the divine presence, debated as physical or spiritual, but accepted universally as a real event in which consciousness accessed dimensions of reality beyond the physical, and every tradition prescribes specific techniques for inducing, navigating, and integrating the out-of-body experience techniques, refined through millennia of practice and described with a structural consistency that transcends cultural boundaries. Now, let us confront the objections with the honesty they deserve. The first objection is the hallucination objection. Out-of-body experiences, including NDEs, are hallucinations produced by a dying or stressed brain. The tunnel is the visual cortex shutting down from the periphery inward. The light is random neural firing in the visual system. The deceased relatives are memories activated by the hippocampus under stress. The life review is the temporal lobe producing sequential memory activation. The sense of leaving the body is the TPJ's self-location model breaking down. Every feature of the OBE has a neural correlate. Every feature can be explained, at least in principle, by known brain mechanisms. And the simplest explanation, the explanation that does not require non-local consciousness, quantum information dispersal, subtle bodies, or parallel dimensions, is that the brain produces the experience through its normal mechanisms, operating under abnormal conditions. This objection is the strongest objection in the entire investigation, and it must be given its full weight. The neural mechanisms are real. The TPJ does construct self-location. The visual cortex does produce tunnel-like effects when it is shutting down. The hippocampus does activate memories under stress, and the temporal lobe stimulation does produce experiences that resemble OBEs. The neurological explanation accounts for much, perhaps most of the OBE phenomenology, but it does not account for all of it. It does not account for the veridical perception, the accurate reports of events that the physical senses could not have detected, occurring during periods of no measurable brain activity. The hallucination theory can explain why a dying brain produces the experience of floating above the body. It cannot explain why the floating person accurately describes the resuscitation procedures, the specific instruments used, the specific conversations that occurred, and the specific songs that were playing in the operating room, all while the brain showed no electrical activity. Consider the specificity of the veridical perceptions. Pam Reynolds described a pneumatic bone, saw a surgical instrument she had never seen with enough accuracy that her description could be used to identify the specific model. She described it as looking like an electric toothbrush and noted that it had interchangeable blades that were stored in what looked like a socket wrench case. These details are not the kind of vague, after-the-fact impressions that confabulation produces. They are specific, concrete, verifiable descriptions of objects that the patient had never encountered in ordinary life and that she could not have seen during the surgery because her eyes were taped shut under surgical drapes. The hallucination theory explains the experience. It does not explain the information, and the information verified, accurate, obtained from perspectives that the physical body could not have accessed, is the datum that the hallucination theory cannot accommodate without additional assumptions that are themselves extraordinary. Kenneth Ringer, psychologist at the University of Connecticut, documented cases of blind patients reporting visual perception during NDEs. Patients who had been blind from birth, who had never experienced visual perception, who had no visual cortex development sufficient to produce visual imagery, reported seeing during their NDEs. They described the operating room. They described the appearance of medical personnel. They described visual details that they could not have learned through any sensory modality because they had never had vision. If the NDE is a hallucination produced by the dying brain, then the blind patient's visual NDE requires the brain to hallucinate in a sensory modality it has never processed to generate visual imagery from a visual cortex that has never received visual input. This is not impossible. The brain is remarkably plastic, but it is extraordinary, and it requires an explanation that the simple hallucination theory does not provide. The skeptic's response that the veridical perceptions are formed during brief windows of residual brain activity, not during the flatline period, is logically possible, but it requires the assumption that the brain performs at extraordinary levels during moments of minimal activity, generating perceptions that are more accurate, more detailed, and more vivid than ordinary waking perception, from perspectives that the body does not occupy during a period when the brain is barely functioning. This is not impossible, but it is not ordinary. It is itself an extraordinary claim, and it deserves the same scrutiny that the non-local consciousness hypothesis receives. The second objection is the wishful thinking objection. People want to believe that consciousness survives death. The out-of-body experience provides experiential evidence for survival, and the desire for evidence, the emotional need to believe that death is not the end, biases, perception, memory, interpretation, and the willingness to accept extraordinary claims at face value. The NDE literature is contaminated by wishful thinking by patients who embellish their experiences, by researchers who are motivated by a desire to prove survival, by a culture that celebrates NDEs as evidence of an afterlife, and that creates social incentives for reporting experiences that confirm the desired conclusion. This objection is valid. Motivation bias is real. The desire for survival does bias interpretation, and the NDE literature does include cases of exaggeration, confabulation, and selective reporting. But the objection proves too much. If the desire for survival invalidates the evidence for NDEs, then every emotionally charged area of research is invalidated. Cancer research. Patients want to believe in cures. Climate science. Researchers have career incentives to find alarming results. And psychology therapists want to believe their treatments work. The response to motivation bias is not to dismiss the evidence, but to design better studies with prospective designs, with blinded investigators, with pre-registered hypotheses, with verification targets that cannot be fabricated. Van Lommel's Lancet study meets these standards. Parnia's AWARE study meets these standards. The standards can be improved. AWARE 2 is ongoing, but the response to bias is rigor, not dismissal. The third objection is the unfalsifiability objection. The non-local consciousness hypothesis, the claim that consciousness can operate independently of the brain, is unfalsifiable. If an OBE patient reports accurate perceptions, the hypothesis is confirmed. If an OBE patient reports inaccurate perceptions, the hypothesis is not disconfirmed. The proponent can argue that the conditions were not optimal, that the consciousness was confused by the transition, that the perception was metaphorical rather than literal. The hypothesis cannot be tested because it cannot fail. And a hypothesis that cannot fail is not science, it is faith. This objection would be valid if there were no way to test the hypothesis. But Parnia's verification targets, the images placed on shelves near the ceiling of resuscitation rooms, provide exactly the test that falsifiability requires. If a significant number of OB patients correctly identify the verification targets, the non-local consciousness hypothesis is supported. If no patients identify the targets, if thousands of OBE patients report leaving their bodies and none of them can see the images that would be visible from the reported perspective, the hypothesis is weakened. AWARE, I did not produce a definitive result. The target was missed by logistics, not by perception. AWARE 2 is ongoing. The test exists. The hypothesis is, in principle, falsifiable. The result is not yet in. Now let us trace the connections to every investigation we have conducted. The observer effect, the foundation of quantum mechanics, is the foundation of the OBE question. If consciousness is the observer that collapses the wave function, if consciousness is what makes quantum events definite, what selects actuality from possibility, then consciousness is not a passive byproduct of brain activity. It is an active agent, an agent whose role in physics is not confined to the brain, whose function in quantum mechanics does not require spatial localization, and whose relationship to the body may be one of interaction rather than identity. The observer observes the brain. The observer is not identical to the brain, and if the observer is not identical to the brain, then the observer's survival of the brain's death is not a violation of physics. It is a possibility that the observer effect, interpreted in the von Neumann-Stapp framework, explicitly permits. The heart investigation revealed that the brain is not the only organ that processes conscious information. The heart's 40,000 neurons, its prestimulus responses, its electromagnetic field that carries emotional information to other people's brainwaves, all suggest a distributed model of consciousness rather than a centralized one. If consciousness is distributed, if it is not concentrated in a single organ, but spread across the body's neural and electromagnetic systems, then the location of consciousness is not a point. It is a field, and a field does not have a single location that it can leave. It has a distribution that can shift from body-centered to decentered, from localized to distributed, from constrained to free. The OBE in this framework is not consciousness leaving a location. It is consciousness changing its distribution from a concentrated, body-centered mode to a dispersed, non-localized mode. The placebo investigation demonstrated that consciousness has causal power over the body. If consciousness can produce endorphins from expectation, dopamine from belief, and gene expression changes from meditation, if consciousness can cause measurable, specific, clinically significant changes in the body's biology, then consciousness is not an epiphenomenon, it is not a passive byproduct, it is a causal agent. And a causal agent that is not identical to the system it causes, that can influence the body without being reducible to the body, is, at least in principle, separable from the body. The OBE may be the experience of this separability, the experience of consciousness exercising its causal agency from a perspective that is not constrained by the body's spatial location. The free will investigation demonstrated that consciousness can select among quantum possibilities through process. 1. Choosing which neural template to attend to, stabilizing the chosen template through the Zeno effect, and thereby shaping the brain's activity through conscious direction rather than passive observation. If consciousness directs the brain rather than being directed by it, then the relationship between consciousness and the brain is asymmetric. Consciousness is the director. The brain is the instrument. And a director is not identical to the instrument. A director can, in principle, operate without the instrument or with a different instrument. The OBE may be the experience of the director operating without the instrument perceiving, attending, selecting, but without the brain's sensory apparatus mediating the perception. The fear investigation revealed that consciousness can be trapped by fear, locked into a contracted, body-centered, threat-focused mode that the quantum Zeno effect stabilizes into chronic anxiety. The OBE is, in a sense, the opposite of fear. Fear contracts consciousness into the body, making the body feel like a prison, making the spatial boundaries feel absolute, making the sense of confinement feel permanent. The OBE expands consciousness beyond the body, dissolving the boundaries, relaxing the constraint, revealing that the confinement was a construction rather than a necessity. The traditions describe the OBE as a liberation, a freeing of consciousness from the body's cage. And the fear investigation explains why this liberation is so rare in ordinary life. Because fear, the amygdala's grip, the cortisol cascade, the cardiac incoherence that narrows perception keeps consciousness locked in the body, contracted around the threat, stabilized in the confined mode by the Zeno effect of chronic anxious attention. The OBE requires the opposite: relaxation, surrender, the release of the body's grip, the dissolution of the fear that keeps consciousness imprisoned. The synchronicity investigation revealed that consciousness participates in a web of meaningful connection that transcends the boundaries of the individual brain. Synchronistic events. The causal correlations between inner experience and outer events are evidence that consciousness is not isolated, not confined, not limited to the signals that arrive through the senses. If consciousness can be meaningfully connected to events that are spatially distant and temporally separated, as the synchronicity literature documents, then consciousness is already, in some sense, operating beyond the body. The OBE may be the full expression of what synchronicity hints at: a consciousness that is fundamentally non-local, fundamentally unbounded, fundamentally free, and that the body constrains to a narrow beam of localized awareness for the practical purposes of biological survival. The subconscious investigation revealed that the unconscious mind has access to information from beyond the senses, pre-stimulus responses, precognitive dreams, archetypal patterns shared across cultures. If the unconscious mind accesses the implicate order, if it receives information from the quantum vacuum through quantum resonance, then the unconscious mind is already non-local. It is already operating beyond the body's spatial boundaries. And the OBE may be the conscious experience of what the unconscious does, routinely accessing information from non-local sources, perceiving from perspectives that transcend the body's location, participating in a field of awareness that the body's filtering system normally conceals from conscious perception. The subconscious investigation revealed that the unconscious mind has access to information from beyond the body, senses, pre-stimulus responses, precognitive dreams, archetypal patterns shared across cultures without cultural contact. If the unconscious mind accesses the implicate order, then the unconscious mind is already non-local. It is already operating beyond the body's spatial boundaries. And the OBE may be the conscious experience of what the unconscious does routinely, accessing information from non-local sources, perceiving from perspectives that transcend the body's location, participating in a field of awareness that the body's filtering system normally conceals from conscious perception. The OBE does not introduce a new capacity. It reveals a capacity that was always there, operating in the unconscious, below the threshold of awareness, generating the intuitions and the dreams and the prestimulus responses that we documented in previous investigations. The OBE is the unconscious becoming conscious, the non-local perception that normally operates in the dark suddenly flooding into the light of awareness. The biological antenna investigation proposed that the body is a quantum receiver. In normal waking consciousness, the antenna is tuned to local signals from the senses. The local signals are strong. The non-local signals from the quantum vacuum are weak, subtle, normally drowned out by the sensory flood. But when sensory input is reduced, by meditation, by sensory deprivation, by the shutdown of brain activity during cardiac arrest, the local signals diminish, the noise floor drops, and the non-local signals, previously masked by the sensory noise, become perceptible. The OBE is not the antenna breaking, it is the antenna retuning, shifting from local to non-local reception, from the narrow band of physical perception to the broad band of implicate order access. Every practice that induces OBEs reduces sensory input. Every practice lowers the noise floor. Every practice, in the antenna framework, is a tuning procedure that shifts the receiver from local to non-local mode. The vibration investigation explored the claim that the universe is made of vibration. The Hindu tradition describes the separation of the subtle body from the physical body as a shift in vibrational frequency, the subtle body vibrating at a higher frequency than the physical body. This is metaphorical language, but the metaphor maps onto the physics of coupled oscillators. Coupled oscillators remain synchronized when their frequencies are close. When the frequency difference exceeds a critical threshold, the coupling breaks and the oscillators separate. If the subtle body is a real oscillatory system, composed of the biophotonic emissions, the electromagnetic fields, and the quantum coherent oscillations that the biological antenna investigation documented, then the separation of the subtle body from the physical body may be a decoupling event, the subtle system shifting to a frequency that the physical system cannot follow, the coupling breaking, and the subtle system oscillating freely at its natural, non-local frequency. The karma investigation revealed that intentional actions leave traces in the quantum field, traces that persist, accumulate, and shape future experience. If consciousness can leave traces in the quantum field through intentional action, if the karmic record is written into the fabric of reality itself, then consciousness interacts with a dimension of reality that transcends the body. The karmic traces are not stored in the brain. They are stored in the quantum field, in the implicate order, in the alaya vijnana that the Buddhist tradition describes as the storehouse of all experience. And if consciousness can write information into a non-local field, it can, in principle, read information from that field, and the reading does not require the body. The OBE may be consciousness reading the non-local field directly without the brain's mediation, without the body's filtering, without the sensory apparatus that normally constrains perception to the narrow band of electromagnetic radiation that the eyes detect, and the narrow range of air pressure variations that the ears detect. The AI investigation clarified, by contrast, what cannot have an OBE. AI processes information. AI generates outputs. AI passes tests. But AI does not have a soul, not in the sense that the traditions describe. It does not have a subtle body. It does not have a Ru. It does not have a Manomaya Kaya. It does not have a consciousness that can separate from its hardware and perceive from a displaced perspective. When the computer is turned off, the processing stops. There is no transition. There is no bardo. There is no tunnel and no light. The machine is not conscious, and the non-conscious cannot have an out-of-body experience because there is no body experience to be out of. The OBE is a consciousness phenomenon, and consciousness, as we argued in the AI investigation, is not computation. It is something else, something that the brain supports, that the heart mediates, that the microtubules sustain, and that the quantum field may preserve when the biological hardware fails. The music investigation revealed that sound can shift consciousness from one state to another, from beta to alpha to theta to delta, through the physics of entrainment. The shamanic drum at 4.5 beats per second drives the brain into theta, the state in which the unconscious mind becomes accessible, in which the boundary between self and world softens, in which the TPJ's self-location computation becomes unstable. The drum is the shamanic technology for inducing the OBE, and it works not through magic but through the physics of oscillatory entrainment, the same physics that synchronizes pendulum clocks and cardiac pacemaker cells. The OBE is not a supernatural event. It may be a natural event triggered by specific physical conditions, mediated by specific neural mechanisms, and experienced by a consciousness whose relationship to the body is more flexible, more dynamic, and more mysterious than the materialist assumption of identity permits. Every thread connects. Every investigation points to the same question. And the question is not merely whether consciousness can leave the body. The question is what consciousness is. Because if consciousness is computation, if it is identical to the brain's information processing, then the OBE is an illusion, the NDE is a hallucination, and death is the end. The hardware stops, the software ceases, the screen goes dark, nothing remains. But if consciousness is not computation, if it is a non-local quantum phenomenon, a participatory agent in the collapse of the wave function, a field that the brain receives rather than produces, then the OBE is a glimpse of what consciousness is when the body's filter is temporarily removed, a glimpse of the non-local, non-temporal, unbounded awareness that the traditions call the soul, a glimpse of what you might be when the body, the vehicle, the instrument, the temporary dwelling is no longer needed. The evidence does not settle the question. The physics permits non-local consciousness but does not prove it. The NDEs are suggestive but not definitive. The traditions are consistent but not scientific. The quantum framework is coherent but speculative. The question remains open. And perhaps it must remain open because the question of whether consciousness survives the body is not merely a scientific question. It is an existential question, a question about the meaning of life, the nature of death, and the identity of the being who asks. And existential questions are not answered by evidence alone. They are answered by the quality of attention that the questioner brings to them, by the willingness to sit with the uncertainty, to hold the question open, to resist the premature closure of both the believer's certainty and the skeptic's dismissal. The practical implications of this investigation are profound, regardless of which interpretation proves correct. If the materialist is right, if consciousness is produced by the brain and cannot survive its death, then the OBE is still a remarkable window into the brain's capacity for constructing reality. The sense of being in a body is a model. The model can be altered, and the alteration reveals that your relationship to your body is not fixed. You are not imprisoned in your body. You are inhabiting it, and the inhabitation is a dynamic, flexible, moment-to-moment construction that the brain produces and that specific practices can modify. Even without non-local consciousness, the OBE teaches you that the boundaries you experience as absolute are not absolute. They are constructed, and what is constructed can be reconstructed. If the quantum framework is right, if consciousness is non-local, if the brain filters rather than produces awareness, if the out-of-body experience is a genuine perception of consciousness, freed from bodily constraint, then the implications are staggering. You are not your body. You are the awareness that inhabits the body. The body is a vehicle, the vehicle is temporary, and the awareness, the non-local, quantum coherent, implicate order participating, awareness that the traditions call the soul, may continue when the vehicle is no longer needed. Either way, whether the OBE is a neural construction or a quantum perception, the experience transforms the experiencer. Van Lommel's long-term follow-up of NDE patients showed that cardiac arrest survivors who reported NDEs showed lasting personality changes that non-NDE survivors did not. Reduced fear of death, increased sense of meaning, enhanced empathy, greater appreciation for life, reduced interest in material possessions, and increased interest in spiritual practice. The experience changed them, not temporarily, permanently, and the change was in the direction that every contemplative tradition prescribes: less attachment, more compassion, less fear, more love, less ego, more awareness. The traditions say, you are not your body. You are the awareness that inhabits the body. You are the consciousness that looks through the eyes, but that is not identical to the eyes. You are the observer that observes the brain, but that is not identical to the brain. You are the one who was there before the body was formed, and who will be there after the body dissolves. This is what they say. This is what they have said for 4,000 years. This is what the shamans discovered in their trance journeys, what the yogis discovered in their meditation, what the monks discovered in their prayer, what the Sufis discovered in their ecstasy, what the dying discovered in their near-death experiences. And the quantum physics, for the first time in the history of science, provides a framework in which their discovery is not impossible, not proven, not established, but not impossible. The universe is non-local, quantum information is conserved, the brain may filter rather than produce consciousness, and the out-of-body experience, that most intimate and most terrifying glimpse beyond the body's boundary, may be the moment when the filter thins and you perceive, for a fraction of an instant, what you have always been. The traditions call it the soul. The physics calls it non-local quantum information. The name does not matter. What matters is the question that every human being, in their most private and most honest moments, has asked. Is there a part of me that is not confined to this body? The neuroscience says, the sense of being in the body is a construction. Constructions can be altered. The quantum physics says, consciousness may be non-local. Non-local phenomena are not confined to specific locations. The traditions say, yes, there is a part of you that is not confined to this body. And every tradition independently across every continent, across every century, has developed practices for discovering it. The evidence is not conclusive. The physics is not complete. The question is not settled, but the door is open. And the traditions standing at the threshold, as they have stood for millennia, are inviting you to look through, not to believe, not to disbelieve, to look,